As a church, it's our vision to connect people to Jesus and love our community. Part of connecting to Jesus is recognizing that we all come from different places. Today, we're kicking off a new series called Why Do You Do That? Why do you do that? And the whole premise of this series is to look at some of the things, some of the basis of faith that those in older generations have done so well that now is shifting with younger generations. And this morning, we're going to kind of lay the baseline as to why this is important. There are things in those that are in the older generations of our society, when it comes to their faith, that they have held rock solid to. And over the next couple weeks, we're going to answer some of those questions, like, why do you go to church every week? Statistics say that right now, families go to church 1.7 times a month. But those in an older generation, every week, no matter what's going on. We're going to ask some different questions along those lines. One of the things that I love about Crossroads is that when you look around the lobby or even around this room is that we are a multi-generational church. I love the fact that we can look and we can find people real quickly that are older than us, and we can find people that are much younger than us. And one of my favorite things to do is in between transitions, so in between the 8 and 9:30 and the 9:30 and the 11, is just to stand out in our lobby and just watch what happens. Because it is a lobby that is filled with laughter. It's a lobby that is chasing kids. It is a lobby full of hugs. But it's not just the people that are like one another. When you look around our lobby, it is people that are younger and older, and everybody is colliding in this moment. I love it that we as a church, we recognize the fact that in order for us to get along and to bring this message of Jesus to others, there has to be this generational agreeance. And maybe we've never thought of it that way, but here's what this looks like is for us to bring Jesus to the world, there has to be a recognition that across all generations there is a greater purpose, and that purpose is the kingdom of Jesus. But really, what does it look like? And maybe more importantly, who's responsible for it? Like, who's responsible for all of the different generations getting along? But not just getting along, recognizing that there is a greater purpose in the kingdom of Jesus that we are responsible for. Back a couple weeks ago, I took a group of some of our family ministry volunteers, some of our student ministry volunteers, our kids ministry volunteers, people that pour time into the upcoming generations. I took them to Kansas City, and I have a group picture here. The bald guy in the back, that is Reggie Joyner. He is the developer of all the curriculum that we use downstairs with our kids to teach them about Jesus. But anyway, while we were at this conference, right after lunch, if you have ever spoken to people in general, the worst time to speak is right after lunch, right? Because everybody is they're full, everybody's tired, and then you have to get up and keep everybody's attention. And so right after lunch, we walk in, we find our seats, and they have us all stand up. And they said, all right, we know that you're full, we know that you're kind of tired, and so we want to kind of warm everybody up for the next session. And I look up on stage, and there's like 6 people that are younger than me, and they're all standing there and said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're all going to dance together. Now, I'm feeling good about this. I shared last series that I enjoy dancing a little bit, and so I'm kind of feeling energized. And so they showed us this dance. It was called the Church Clap, and there's this artist, Lecrae. He sings this song, Church Clap. You can look it up later. But anyway, there's a dance that goes with this song. And so they teach us this dance, and you move right and you move left, and then there's one part of the song, you swing your leg up and you clap underneath it. All right? Now, I've got about as much space as you have sitting there in between the pews as we're sitting in these chairs. And I'm sitting next to Adam Schetzler, our new kids minister, who will start in December. I'm standing next to him, and we're almost exactly the same age. And so we watch the instructions, and you move right and you move left, and then the music picks up, and you bounce right and you bounce left, and then you do this leg kick thing. Now, what I failed to recognize and what they failed to tell us is after you do this leg clap, you turn and you just keep doing the same thing. And so they said, all right, does everybody got it? And we were like, yeah. And I'm feeling good. I can move right, left, and I can kind of do this leg kick, and I can keep up. So then they start the music. we start moving right, and then we all start moving left. And then the music kicks, and we hop, and we hop, and we do this leg kick. And I was good until that moment. And then they turned, and everybody just kept doing it. And I stood there. I stood there. Adam stood there. Most of the people in our row, we stood there because we did not know what we were doing. And I looked up, and everybody on stage who was younger than me is all just doing this flawlessly. And I realized in that moment, even in my mid-30s, the next generation below me knows this so much better. And guess what? I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I stood there, I was like, no, I will not be passed up on the church clap. And to the point that later in the week, after school one day, I said to Levi, let's learn to dance together. And so in my living room, we pull up YouTube and how to do the church clap. And me and Levi, we stand there in my living room and learning how to do this dance. And then Emily jumped in and she did it better than me, but don't tell her I said that. But she, it turned into this family experience. And I was like, there is no way that this is going to happen on my watch. I'm not getting caught off guard again. Without any conversation whatsoever, Adam texts me the next day and he says, I've got great news for you. And I didn't know what it was. My first thought was he's coming early, but that wasn't it. But he texted, I said, what's your great news? And he said, I went home and practiced and I mastered the church clap. Because neither of us, we were not going to admit that we were being passed by. And there's a lot of us in the room that we know that feeling all too well. And right now, you and I, we are living in a time that in the church, there are 5 different generations in our church. There are the elders, they're the silent generation. There are the boomers. There's Gen X. There's the millennials, and there's Gen Z. And there's even some underneath that are starting to move up. And within each of these generations, within each of the different generations that are around our church, we all see life differently. Not only do we see life differently, we see church differently. There are different tenets of the church. There are different places in the church that we find of greater importance than other generations. Each generation looks at Jesus from a different angle. Each generation invites people to church with different methods. Each generation communicates differently. Each generation values differently. But here's what I'm convinced of. For the gospel to be made known, it takes every generation working together. For the gospel of Jesus to be made known, it takes every generation working together. And so here's my question out of the gate. What is your commitment to the generation that comes before you? And what is your commitment to the generation that comes after you? What is your commitment to the generation that came before you, and what is your commitment to the generation that comes after you? Because in all honesty, it's real easy to, and most likely that we have written one of those two off, right? They don't do it the same, or they do it different. And there are lots of different places that we could fill in those blanks. We've most likely written either before or after off. But what is our commitment as Jesus people? What is our commitment to the generation that came before us and the generation that is coming after us? Because for the gospel to be made known, it takes all the generations working together. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open up to the book of Titus. It'll be on the screen, or you're also welcome to look it up on your phone. Titus is towards the end of the New Testament, towards the back of your Bible. The book of Titus is a letter. It's a letter written by this guy named Paul. And what Paul is doing is he's writing to a guy named Titus who is in this region known as Crete. It's an island. And he is working with a church there that's kind of struggling. It's also kind of new. And so he is working with this new church that's having some struggles. And as Titus is working, Titus is a younger church leader as well. And so Paul writes to Titus to encourage, but also to kind of charge him up, saying this is what you need to do. This is what you need to work towards. And in the beginning part of this letter, in chapter 1, Paul addresses what's not working well. And one of the main things that he addresses is the behavior does not match the belief. Okay, so there are these people that are claiming that they are Jesus followers, but the behavior that they live with does not match up to that. What they are teaching does not match up to the way that they are acting. And so Titus, as this younger church leader, is having to stand up to people that are much older than him, that are not living what they say that they believe. He's having to call them out, saying these two things don't match up. And so, Paul writes, beginning in verse 2, of if this doesn't work, now this is how it's going to work. We're going to begin in verse 1. It says, you, however, so Paul saying, you, Titus, must teach what is appropriate to sound doctrine. Teach the older men to be temperate, worthy of respect, self-controlled, and sound in faith, in love, and in endurance. Likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way that they live, to not be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. Then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. Similarly, encourage the young men to be self-controlled. In everything, set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity, seriousness, soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us. You see, what Paul recognizes is in the society that Titus is living in this community that he is living in, this region, that generational breakdown is something that they understand completely. They understand what is needed for older men, older women, younger women. They understand that as a society. And so what Paul says is we're going to use something that is understood and working well in society, and we're going to use it for a kingdom advantage. And so instead of, hey, Titus, we need you to change everything for these people, we need you to take something that is known to them, and we need you to focus it on the kingdom. And so then he begins to bring kingdom responsibility to each of the different generations. Now, the way that Paul breaks them down is older men, older women, younger women. Now, this whole series, I'm going to talk about generations, and we're going to learn from older and younger men and women as younger men and women. But throughout this whole series, and beginning today, what I am not going to do is classify anyone in this room as to which category you go in. All right? You can decide for yourself, and that can be between you and God, but I am not going to tell you who belongs in what category. But if we were to look at what Paul is writing to Titus, saying, this is what is important. This is what is important. If the behavior does not match the belief within generations, then this is what I need you to focus on. With the older men, okay? So those of you that put yourself in the older man category, it says to be temperate, keeping your cool, in other words, worthy of respect, self-controlled, and sound in faith. So if you are an individual that puts yourself in the older men category, what would be your checkup if these are what's qualified of you? In other words, how are you doing at being temperate? Are you living a faith life that is worthy of respect? Are you self-controlled? Are you rock solid and sound in your faith that people can find wisdom from you? How healthy would you diagnose yourself if that's what is being called of? If you're someone in the room this morning that places yourself in the older women category, and I'm really not going to do anything with that one. But if you're someone that places yourself in the older women category, if what is being called of you is to be reverent in the way that you live, to guard your tongue, that you're not slanderous about anybody else, that you're not addicted to much wine, that you're to teach what is good, and that you're to invest in younger families and younger wives. If you place yourself in the older women category and that is what you're being called to, how are you doing? How healthy are you at being reverent and teaching what is good? Are you investing in younger moms and younger wives to teach them to love what's most important, not everything? If you're someone that would place yourself in the younger woman category, if you're someone that would place yourself as a younger woman, what is being invested into you? How well are you at loving your husband and children? How well are you at being self-controlled and pure? How are you doing at being focused on what is at home and being kind? If you're in the younger woman category, how are we doing? And then those of us younger guys, and I'm still claiming that one, in the room, how are we doing at being self-controlled, guys? And like Titus, who is also a younger man, how are we doing at setting an example of what is good? Are we living with integrity? Is the words that we say, do they match what we believe? How are we doing? You see, for each generation's responsibility, as Paul is writing to Titus, there is this accountability for us today as church people, as Jesus people, whether we've been in it a long time or this is our first day into it, there is this call, no matter where we fit on the generational spectrum, of what it is that we are to live up to. In other words, there is a learning from before and a handing to of what comes next. What is our commitment to the generation that comes before and the generation that comes after? Are we learning from and are we handing to? But why is this important? Like, why is it important that when we are so different, that in this place and in this Jesus space, why is it that we must come together? Why is it that we have to look at one another? Paul tells us that too in verse 5 and verse 8 and then even verse 10, which we didn't read, but we're going to highlight. Verse 5, there's this word so that no one will malign the word of God, focusing back on him. Verse 8, this word so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us. In other words, our character points to him. There's no accusation to be made. And then even later on in verse 10, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God, our Savior, attractive. Attractive. You see, this word so tells us why is it important for those that are in younger generations and those that are in older generations. Why is it important that we collide and don't cause tension but point to Jesus? It's so that we can give a complete picture of the gospel. Because here's what happens. Here's what happens. And I'm pretty confident in saying that we are all guilty of this in one form or fashion. When as Jesus people, okay, when we look at a generation that is older than us or younger than us, and we disagree with how they are doing something, and whatever our disagreement is about, if it turns our behavior to not be like Jesus, okay, I'm going to pick on like my generation or younger, okay? If you're older than me and you look at cell phone habits, not all of them are healthy, okay? But if you look at us, okay, so addicted to technology and communication, everything like that, if you look at us and your disagreement with that type of communication turns your behavior and your words so much that it does not align with what Jesus is calling us to. And you criticize and you call out, and your words and your slander, it is so strong that someone can look and say, you know what, that's not a Jesus person because of what they're saying. If that is happening, then what is being communicated, because we are Jesus people, what is being communicated is that the hope of Jesus does not belong to them. So if you're someone that is criticizing to the point where it's changing your behavior, then what you're communicating is the hope of Jesus does not belong to you because of this generational divide. Now we're going to flip this around. If you're in a younger generation that is addicted to a cell phone and everything like that, and you're looking at an older generation and be like, why do they call each other? That's weird. Why do they spend time just with one another without an agenda? Like, if looking at why do they spend so much time honoring the past? If those of us in a younger generation, if that perspective, if it changes our behavior to the point that we don't look like Jesus people anymore, then what we are saying in the same way is that the hope of Jesus does not belong to the generation that comes after us. You see, when our behavior shifts to the point that it does not look like Jesus because of generational divides, we are communicating to whatever that generation is that the hope of Jesus does not belong to you because you're different. And this could not be farther from the message of the gospel. This could not be further from the message of Jesus that invites everyone to, not divides and pushes everyone away. You see, our behavior among generations paints a picture of the gospel. And what you and I, when we are called to as different generations with different responsibilities within the church, is that all of our, the same way that Paul writes, so that, is all of our behaviors and all of our differences, they all collide and come back to Jesus. And because of Jesus, whether we're in our late 90s or 9 years old, we value one another because Jesus values us. And friends, here's our truth for this morning. A value for people brings value to the gospel. A value for people, young, old, someplace in between, different generations, across different generation lines. When we begin to value people, we bring value to the gospel for others. This gospel message of Jesus that he invites us to forgiveness. You see, when we find value, when we begin to look at people with value, all of a sudden they have a place instead of not belonging. And that's the difference. You see, the message of Jesus is that you value, you matter, you belong here, not you don't, because you're different. What would it look like? What would it look like if this next week, when it comes to your commitment to the generation that comes before you and the generation that comes after you, what if in each of those scenarios you looked and said, what is it and who is it that I value? Because they matter to Jesus, so they matter to me. I think it would change our conversations. It would change our conversations about different people that do things differently. This past week, just the other day, I posted on Facebook, which is a generational distance within itself, but I posted on Facebook, what is the best thing that you have learned from the generation that came before you? Because for the rest of this series, that's what we're talking about. It is the wisdom that the generation that came before us, that they hold. What is the best thing that you learned? And there was lessons of loyalty, and there was lessons of hard work, and there was lessons of not worrying, and there was lessons of staying faithful and true to your word and everything like that. But you know what the number one answer, the most repeated answer out of all of them? Was the word respect. It was the word respect over and over and over again. You see, because I value, I listen to you. I respect you. You see, a value for people brings value to the gospel, which is why Paul is writing these words. Because the gospel matters this much, Titus. Step across the generational lines and bring value to each responsibility, no matter how old or young we are. I love the way the psalmist writes it in Psalm 145, verse 4. It says, one generation commends your work to another. They will tell of your mighty acts. One generation, they commend your works. They say, man, this is what God has done, and it's incredible. These are the mighty acts that he has done in my life, and I can't wait to share them with you. I value what God has done, and I value you. And so, maybe a deeper question is, do we value the people of the gospel more than the methods to communicate the gospel? Because I know of too many churches, just to be real honest, I know of too many churches that when it comes to generations, they will split and they will divide and they will fracture and they will be hurtful over the methods of communicating the gospel. And what that does is it communicates to everybody around is that the forgiveness and the gospel message does not matter as much as how we tell you about it. And what that also says is you don't have any value because I value my way more than I do your person. What our biggest commitment to the generation that comes before and the generation that comes after is I value you enough to focus on Jesus most. I value you enough to focus on Jesus most. Time in my life where I probably learned this most closely or the most was when I was in high school. Early 2000s, late 90s, there was this worship song. If you've been around church world a little while, you'll know. If not, that's fine. Everlasting Love. And there was this part in the song. It was very intricately and deeply written lyrics that you really had to concentrate on how to sing it. There was this one part of the song where the words were woot, 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 woot. Okay, it was very detailed and precise. But during this part of the song, it wasn't just standing there singing. You would hop, woo, 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 and you would hop back and forth, okay, as you were singing this song. And in high school, we thought this was great. Like, we were hopping back and forth all the time, anytime we sang this song. And so there was one Sunday, it was a youth Sunday, which means the youth were leading everything on stage. They were leading worship that day, and we sang that song in worship. Okay, what that also meant is there was about 2.5 rows of junior high and high school students that we were wooting in unison, okay? And we were moving back and forth across the pews as this was happening in the middle of church service. And it was a bunch of fun. Everyone participated. I know that could be a shock. But it was pretty much just our row that was moving back and forth because we knew what was happening and everything like that. We show up at youth group the next... like later on that week. And our youth minister, Mike, he says, hey, we need to spend some time praying for so-and-so. She was an older woman in our church. And we were like, oh, no, what do we do? You know, like, okay. And he said, yeah, she loved worship this past week. And we're like, then why do we need to pray for her? And he said she loved worship so much that when she was singing Everlasting Love, she saw what was happening in the front of the church, in all of the rows, when you guys were bouncing back and forth, that she wanted to sing the song too. We're like, that's awesome. And so she went home. This is like church clap, 20 years pre. She went home and she practiced in her kitchen. Woo, woo, woo. Woo, 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 which was awesome to hear as a high schooler. And then Mike looked at us and he said, and then she fell and broke her hip. We were like, ah. And that's where the story takes a turn. She was so excited to worship in a different way because it was celebrating Jesus that she wanted to do it. Even to the point where it brought her home and ended up getting her hurt. There's a lot that I have forgotten about high school, but when it comes to my faith. But one of the things that I remember is hearing about what this woman did. Why? Because this woman, who was much, much older, in a much different place generationally than I was, especially at that time, cared so much about celebrating Jesus and doing it with energy and passion that she was willing to try something different and do it in a different way that somebody so much younger than her was doing it. And it was because she valued her relationship with Jesus. But as a high school student at that time, it also meant that she valued us. Because she was willing to take that big step And it was different, and it was different than how she did it, and it was different than how she grew up doing it. But she wanted to worship with us, not against us. Because she saw value in us, not how we were doing something. And friends, this is exactly what Jesus does for you and me. Is he sees value in us, not how we're doing something or not doing something. He sees value in us. The Bible says when we were at our worst, when we were sinful, that's when he died for us. He sees value in us. And he didn't look down from a cross and say, well, I mean, they're mature enough and they're old enough and so they get my grace. And he didn't look down from the cross and say, they're young enough and they have energy enough and they're bringing something new. And so my grace is for them. He looked down at us. He says, I value them all as my children. And not I value the boomers, and not I value the Gen X, and not I value the millennials. It's I value them because they are my children. You see, when we value people, we bring value to the gospel for everybody to see. And this is exactly what Jesus did for us. Whether you're in the elder generation or the Gen Z generation, there's a Jesus that died for you, that finds value in you, and that says you matter. There's a Jesus that hung on a cross and went through a brutal death to take care of the sins of all generations. And so from generation to generation to generation, we can tell of his mighty acts and what he has done for our lives. When we see value in people, we bring value to the gospel for everyone to see. This morning, are you finding value in the generation that came before you? And are you valuing the generation that comes after you? Are you valuing them as children and as people more than how they do things? Because when we value people, we become like Jesus to bring the gospel message no matter what generation they're a part of. Let's go ahead and stand together. We're going to worship. We're going to sing of this love that Jesus has for us. A love that steps across generational lines. A love that steps into our darkest places. A love that runs after us in our worst moments. Whether we're 90 or 9, it's the love of Jesus that shapes who we are. It's the love of Jesus that brings hope to our lives. It's a value for his children. It's a value that no matter where we stand right now, he says, I see you as my children. You matter. And for us today, for us to bring this message of Jesus, this gospel message of Jesus, this forgiveness of Jesus, to bring this message of Jesus, it takes all the generations coming together. Doesn't matter how young or old you are right now, this time is not about us. This time is about him. Let's sing together.